Hello. Welcome. I'm Åsa Besson from the Nordic Northwest Lecture Committee. Thank you for coming tonight. We are 24 people here in the Great Hall, and the rest of the people are sitting at home and listening. As a matter of fact, we are 139 altogether. These lectures are an important part of the history of the Nordic Northwest, which was founded in 1986 to support the Nordic languages at PSU and have evolved to support all things Nordic in Oregon and Southwest Washington. Now I just want to tell you, the one who's sitting at home has a little button called chat, and you can ask questions there, which we will answer afterwards. And the people in the room here have a little clipboard with small slips on it and a pen, and they can ask questions. And at the end, if you do have some questions, I'm not becoming a basket case, but I want to say that I will come and pick the things up in this basket. Just raise your hand, and I'll come and pick up your questions toward the end, maybe it's 15 minutes before or so. I will come and pick it up. So, and we have two speakers tonight. One is Dr. Frank Granshaw, and the other one is Dr. Scott Burns. Dr. Frank Granshaw, he's a main speaker, and Scott Burns just steps in toward the end. However, I'll give him credit for having coerced the main speaker to come here tonight. They work together at Portland State. Let me just say a little bit about Scott in case you don't know who he is. Most people do. Scott has enlightened us many times with lectures on geology. He has spoken about Iceland, Denmark, and Norway. And he has a PhD in geology, and he has taught at PSU for 39 years, and altogether he has taught 51 years. I told him he ought to retire because he could end up getting old on the job. So I would let Scott Burns introduce the key speaker, Frank Granshaw.
So thank you very much, Åsa, for that introduction. And back at the beginning of the year, Åsa got in touch with me and said, Scott, we need to have a lecture on climate change in the Nordic countries. And I said, wow, that would be really great, because I've been involved in research and publications ever since 1970, Earth Day, and teaching environmental science and climate change and climate warming. But I said, there's a guy at Portland State who knows a lot more than me, and that's Frank Granshaw. And so I asked Frank. Frank said yes, he would. And so we were going to do a team effort here. And he was going to do the big picture. I was going to do the Nordic countries. But then he showed me his PowerPoint. And I said, you did all of the Nordic countries too, much better than I could ever do. So he is going to be doing the major talk tonight. Frank he's been teaching for a long time too. He got his bachelor's degree from Linfield College in physics. And then he got his Master of Arts teaching at Lewis and Clark College. And then he got another master's degree at Portland State in geology and a PhD in geology studying glaciers, which ties in with climate change. But he has been teaching climate change for many, many years at Portland State, and he's involved not only locally but regionally and internationally. And he'll be telling you towards the end about COP and our involvement. And the Nordic countries have been doing so much related to climate change, and we will be focusing in on that at the end. And that's also where the fastest climate change is occurring in the world too. So it really does have a great effect. And so at this time, what I would like to do is turn it over to Frank and welcoming. Frank welcomed and his wife Annette, who is here tonight. And in fact, in this room, there are only about 25, 30 of us. There are 3 Annettes in here, which is small world. But thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Thank you to all of the people that are watching at home. And so how about a round of applause for Frank Granshaw? And he's going to be leading off. So Frank.
Thank you. So am I on? Should be? Oh, there we go. Well, hello. This is a real treat. I've been doing lectures and everything, much as Scott has been doing via Zoom for a long time. So the idea of being in a room with people, wow. So anyway, as the sign says here, what I want to do is talk about climate change in the Nordic countries, and I'll define what the Nordic countries are here in a little bit. A little bit of prelude here. In terms of why talk about climate change in the Nordic countries? Well, obviously, there's an interest here, since many of you have roots there. But there's another couple of compelling reasons for talking about it. First of all, what I call the canary in the coal mine for developed countries. When you talk about the Nordic countries, you're talking about an area that has seen far more rapid climate change, rising temperatures, increased wildfires, etc. Far more of that change than any other part of the world. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is here shortly. And when I say canary in the coal mine for developed countries, what has happened and what will be happening in the Nordic countries in terms of how they adapt is going to be a lesson for the rest of us. Also, trendsetter and cautionary tale. At the very end today, one of the slides I want to pop up is the Will Ferrell Super Bowl commercial. How many know what I'm talking about? Oh, there's a few folks. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's rooted in the fact that Norway in particular has made a strong commitment to electrify its transportation system as a response to climate change. We'll talk more about that as we go. Okay, so let's put all this in terms of a global context. Act 1. Two things we want to look at here: where we are now, and also where we could be headed. So most of what I'm going to have on this slide is essentially what's been happening this last year in 2020. And there's a number of things that are important. First of all, 2020 tied with 2016 as the warmest year on record since records were first kept for global average temperature. And that was 1880. What we also saw was some record heat events. These were set for Russia, Australia, Mexico, the Caribbean, and China. What we refer to as extreme heat events. Record wildfire seasons. Everybody remember our wildfire season last year? Yeah. Okay. We were not alone. If you remember the news, actually this slips into 2019, Australia started with one of its record wildfire seasons, and the Western North America ended up being a record as well. And there were a number of Arctic wildfires in what we call the boreal forest. Some other things that were significant: Arctic sea ice had its second lowest summer minimum since satellite imaging was done of the Arctic sea ice. That was in 1980. Incidentally, what we're talking about by Arctic sea ice is the ice that covers the Arctic Ocean at the North Pole. And that is definitely has some significance to the Nordic countries. When we look at what most of us in the climate community regard as the smoking gun for this climate change, CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels, rose from 411 parts per million up in 2019 up to 413 parts per million in 2020. This is the highest since regular records were being kept of CO2 atmospheric concentration, which started in 1958. And of course, good news, bad news. Between 2019 and 2020, CO2 emissions actually dropped 6.4%. Actually, what you see is that the CO2 emissions dropped radically in April and then started climbing back up again. Good news. So that's good news in the sense of less CO2 going into the atmosphere. Bad news because of how that happened. Where we could be headed. Here gets the fun stuff. There's a graph on the top there. And the jagged part of the graph is actually historical. Global temperature records that were recorded by NOAA, compiled by NOAA, I should say, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. And you can see a definite sort of year-to-year jaggedness, but a trend upwards. The lines that come after that, the rainbow right there, are the lines that represent average global temperature as projected by the International Panel on Climate Change. And there's two paths in particular. The red one, which I'm calling the brown path. Okay, wait a minute. Red. Why are you calling it brown? Well, I'm calling it brown because this is the path that we look at as far as average global temperature. If we continue on our dependence on fossil fuels and continue to ramp up the extraction of fossil fuels. And so in that particular scenario, we're looking at a 4.5 degrees Celsius increase from what's called the pre-industrial mean global temperature. Pre-industrial being 1880. 4.5 doesn't seem like a lot, but it is significant for a number of reasons. There's what we call the green path, which is actually the blue path. Sorry to confuse everybody. The reason why it's called the green path is because this is where the global community gets serious about shifting to renewables and energy efficiency and what we call carbon sequestration and a whole number of what we call climate mitigation procedures. And in that particular case, we see average global temperature only climb about 1.5 degrees. That is actually, amongst many climate scientists, the preferred direction. Okay, now, Act 2. We're going to put it into context as far as Nordic climate. And so I need to clarify who I'm considering to be the Nordic countries, and then also look at some historic and projected change and projected climate change and impacts. Who the Nordic countries are. Okay, this is my bias as a person who, on 2 separate occasions, has had the good fortune to attend UN climate summits. The first one in Bonn, Germany, the second one in Katowice, Poland. And in both of those instances, in what we call the civil society side, which is not the negotiators, but the observers who come to keep track of the process. And part of the civil society side is a major exhibit hall. And one of the major exhibitors there has been the Nordic Council. And so when I talk about the Nordic countries, I'm talking about the members of the Nordic Council, which is Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, with 3 territories, one of which is Greenland, and one of which I can't pronounce because it's that little piece of Swedish territory hanging off the south end of Finland, and the other one I just totally spaced out. Okay, any case here. This is a region of the world that ranges from mild mid-latitude climate to pretty harsh polar climates. Actually, the fact that parts of the Nordic region actually straddle the Arctic Circle is an important reason why we are seeing such radical climate changes in the Nordic countries. It's also home to about 25 million people spread out over about 3.5 million kilometers. So I apologize for this slide in advance because you'll see 2 things there. First of all, on should be on your right side is the cover for a report, which is actually a report from the European Environmental Agency on climate change impacts and vulnerabilities in Europe. And what I did on the other side was essentially take a nice little infographic that they have that list what are called the biogeographic regions, say like the Arctic region or the boreal forest. List those and then list the major impacts that you could expect given those different scenarios we looked at with the graph showing the IPCC projection. What I will tell you is when I get to the very last slide, I have my email address. And so if you want to tunnel further, I will be happy to send you the URL for this slideshow. And one of the things is, such things as the cover right there is actually hyperlinked over to the report. Anyway, so let's cruise along and take a look at some specific impacts. Temperature. Since 1880, global temperature increased by nearly 1 degree Celsius. Some of you might remember Paris 2015, what was called COP21. And there was a target that everybody came away from that particular conference with, was keeping average global temperature to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial average. In other words, we're halfway there. There was a report that came out a little bit later by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that said, we really need to be thinking about 1.5, not 2, if we want to have coral reefs, among other things. And so in any case there, you can see that we're pretty much the way to both of those targets. Well, here's where it gets even more interesting. The Arctic has seen temperature increases during that time of nearly twice global average. The range for Nordic countries has been anywhere between this is by country, their average annual temperature has been anywhere between 0.7 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, there's some direct impacts that go along with those temperature increases, one of which is increasing numbers of extreme heat events. In other words, places close to the Arctic Circle reporting nearly 95 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. And extreme heat events in urban areas are particularly significant, and they pose a public health risk. Some indirect impacts, Scott mentioned, actually, Scott, I did my master's in glacial geology. My doctorate was in geoscience education. And, but thank you for that anyway. So anyway, something that rings a bell with me as far as indirect impacts is warmer temperatures mean less snowfall, warmer summers, and so we're seeing some decreasing snow and ice, particularly in Greenland, Iceland, and Norway, and parts of Sweden. So, precipitation. One of the things that I found interesting in doing this research was Finland is getting a notoriety for major flooding. We've all heard of 100-year events that are now occurring much more frequently, and that's definitely been the case in Finland. And according to the European Environmental Association report I talked about, in 20th century, Northern Europe's precipitation increased by anywhere from 10 to 40%. And the big thing with that is these heavy precipitation events that trigger such things as increased river flow. That's not a bad thing if you've a country like Norway that has a high dependence on hydroelectric, but it is a problem in a place like Finland where these high river flows end up causing extreme flooding, slope instabilities, and then we're also at the same time looking at decreases in summer precipitation. And that one thing that comes along with flooding is another public health risk, which is increase in risk of waterborne disease. Snow and ice. So getting down a little bit more to this, what we're looking at here is widespread glacier recession in Norway. I've seen some predictions from the environment, again from the European Environmental Assessment Report, that you could, under some of the worst case scenarios, be seeing the glaciers in Norway decreasing by as much as about 90% by the year 2100. You're talking about diminishing sea ice, and again here, under worst case scenario, the 4.5 degree rise, you could be looking at the entire Arctic Ocean being ice-free during the summer by 2100. You're also, this is kind of what we call a positive feedback, diminishing tundra. Okay, anybody been to Iceland? Okay, cool place to be. That's my one experience with the Nordic countries. A fair amount of tundra there, certainly a fair amount of tundra in northern parts of Norway and Finland. Well, tundra is essentially has a layer of frozen, grasslands that underneath them, the soil is frozen throughout the year. One of the things that happens in these cases is that organic material will build up in tundra. In other words, rotting vegetation. If it remains frozen, no problem. As the tundra begins to melt, or I should say the permafrost begins to melt, then you start releasing lots of methane, which is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And so it provides what we call a positive feedback loop. Okay, other things to look at: shorter winters, less snowfall in all parts of the Nordic region. So now bringing this home for why people would, other than people like me who are ice ski, would care about all this. Well, it goes like this. If you're into ski tourism in, say, places in Sweden and Norway, this is a decrease in ski. So it has an economic impact. There are changes in hydropower potential. Again, a country like Norway is almost exclusively on its electric grid dependent on hydropower. And if we start seeing glaciers retreat, disappear, we change the stream flow. And that has a lot of impact on power planning. And then also increasing risk of rockfall and landslides. So if we're looking at glacial valleys with very steep sides, glaciers retreat. These very steep sides become unstable. Another thing we can look at here is biodiversity. And actually I've got 3 pictures down there that I captured from a tool called the Environmental Climate Change Model. You notice I got that in green? So if you decide you want to have me send you the URL for this, if you click on anything that's green like that, it will take you someplace. And in this particular case, it'll take you to the Environmental Change Model. And what I have down there is you can see 1800, 2010, and then 2100 with a question mark after. And so what we're looking at here, if you were actually able to play with this tool, is first of all, as regional temperatures and precipitation patterns change, biomes, which are biological communities of plants and animals that exist within a certain climate, these migrate north. So there's the increasing risk of biodiversity loss as plants and animals in these biomes attempt to adjust to these rapid changes. And when we start talking about biodiversity loss, we're talking about extinction. And if say, a boreal forest, which is a cold coniferous forest, migrates very quickly northwards, the plants and animals that are there may not be able to adapt to those changes. One of the things also that's important down here is looking at indigenous. I think, somebody correct me if I get this wrong, Sami people? Say again? Sami. Okay, and they're in, I thought they were in Sweden, but Sweden and Finland. They have a culture that is extremely dependent on reindeer herding. And as these biomes change, that affects their livelihood. Forestry and agriculture, particularly talking about Finland, parts of Sweden, where you've got a very robust forestry industry, talking about changing biomes impacting the character and the viability of regional agriculture and forestry. So there's, and one of the ways that happens is increasing risk of wildfires. I believe it was in 2018, Sweden saw a record number of wildfires. There's also, consequently, you're looking at a decrease in the economic value of these. Having been involved with environmental issues for a long time, I am used to people sort of pitting economics against the health of the environment. One of the things we're beginning to see out of situations like this is those are hand in glove. And now, at the same time here, one of the things that, in terms of decreasing viability of forestry, one of the things we're seeing, which is also something that's happened in Colorado and places in Idaho, is forest pests, particularly pine bark beetles, for instance, coming in and decimating large sections of forest because you don't have as cold winters to keep the populations. Now, one of the things I love about the European Environmental Agency's report is that they also looked at some of the positives of all of this. Because if we're looking at an increasing temperature in the Nordic countries, one of the things we could be looking at is a potential increase in crop yield, particularly in the northern portion of the Nordic region. Now, there's a trick to that, however. Remember I said that increasing precipitation, increasing number of extreme rainfall events, well, increased erosion. So, plus that bit about forest pests, that also applies to agriculture. So it's kind of tricky how that works. Now, last but not least, okay, any of us are aware, the Nordic region is an area heavily dependent on fisheries. Fair number of urban areas on along coastlines. And when we look at coastal flooding from sea level rise, increased river flows, and more intense winter storms, we're talking about something that can be posing some problems for major urban areas. Oh, incidentally, the one thing I should mention here really quickly is that sea level rise affecting coastal areas is not uniform across the Nordic area because of the fact that there are sections of the Nordic areas that during the last ice age, 25,000, 30,000 years ago, were under a pretty good sized chunk of ice. Now that's gone, and that landscape is slowly rising as it's rebounding from being pushed down. So that being said, it's not necessarily the case for Copenhagen. Okay, so we also look here at increase in sea surface temperature, just like on land, causing this shift northwards in marine communities, which would be good in terms of, but it will in terms of introducing new species into an area, could be problematic. But along with that is an increasing number of what we call marine dead zones. Oregon actually has, I think, 2 marine dead zones off of our coast. And what these are is deep ocean environments where the temperature has become warm enough that there's virtually no oxygen, or I shouldn't say there's virtually no oxygen. There's very little oxygen in those deep ocean communities. Hence, a loss of biodiversity, which has an impact for fisheries. So, what we're looking at here is both risk and opportunities for regional fisheries as a result of the 2 previous impacts. Okay, Act 3, Nordic response. And what we're going to look at here is current energy production. And the reason why I'm going to look at energy production is because if you look at the world energy production, roughly 85% of end-use energy is being produced by 3 fuels: coal, oil, and natural. All 3 of them are major contributors as far as greenhouse gas emissions. One of the other things I want to take a look at here is commitments to emission reduction. This is one place that is very interesting in the Nordic countries. And then also look at their strategies for getting to them. Oops, try that again. There we go. Okay, again, this actually is in the online version of this media. It has it so you can click on the cover, which is the pink out there in the side, and pull up this is actually not a document, it's a short infographic put out by the Nordic Research Council that looks at 10 insights into Nordic country energy production. And so to make things a little bit less confusing, that we got really small type, I want to draw your attention to the red squares. Because what I did in those red squares was to separate out what is called the renewables. Well, not only the renewables, but renewables and nuclear energy from the fossil fuels. And one of the things that's of interest here is that one country that outshines everyone else in the world for using renewables is Iceland. Out of their total picture, which is what the panels are across the top, out of their total picture there, only 23% of their energy comes from coal, oil, and natural gas. The bulk of it comes from hydropower and geothermal. One of the interesting countries in this, with about 48% dependence on fossil fuels, is Norway. And why I say it's interesting is because, first of all, if we look down at the bottom chart there, which is electric power generation in 2017, and it has the electric power generation. Oh, terrible. I got to go correct that. Yeah, big problem. I left out a column of numbers. Sorry about that. But the lion's share of the electric power generation in Norway is hydropower. Now, it varies a little bit in different countries. Like, for instance, Sweden has a fair amount of, Sweden has a fair amount of biomass and hydro. Biomass being essentially burning wood, methane digestion, from sewage, things of that sort. But then also you see the big yellow square down there. They have a fair amount of nuclear. Another country that has a fair amount of nuclear is Finland. Denmark is an interesting one because everybody familiar with Vestas? Okay, they've actually got a corporate headquarters down in Portland. Say again? Yep. And it's a wind power company. Originates out of Denmark. And so when you look at Denmark's power production, it is a fair amount of wind. That's the blue square. Okay, Denmark's clear. Okay, everybody see where Denmark is over by the pink cover? Yeah. And then the next thing that they have down there, red. Here, hold on. See if I can fall. Oh, wait, I got it backwards. No, the red is wind, and biomass is the blue square. Okay, now, I show you all of that not to get everybody's eyes to roll back in their head after looking at this quad of numbers, but to give you a sense of perspective of where the Nordic countries are now in trying to deal with a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, their energy production. Now, the next graph I want to pop in here shows a couple of things. First of all, a lot of different squiggly lines. The red ones are the ones that are important. And these squiggly lines are for Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. And one of the things that's important that we're looking at here is those squiggly lines represent greenhouse gas emissions. What you can see there, well, start with Finland, or not Finland, Denmark. Start with Denmark. You notice it dropped nearly 30% in 1990. Finland is about 22% drop. Iceland is one that I have to figure out. It's actually got a 28% increase. That's one I got to try to see if I can figure out, given the fact that most of their energy mix tends to be renewables. I have no answer for that one. We go over to Sweden. Sweden has dropped down by about 25%. And then Norway, 4% increase. Anybody know what's a major industry in Norway? What? Oil, right. Yeah, I've got a neighbor whose son teaches in Bergen, and he was quick to point out that, well, this nice stuff about EV increases, yeah, we got other problems. Anyway, strategies for improving on this. Oh, should back up for a moment. What's important here? Yep, didn't want to go back that far. Denmark has made a commitment to be independent of fossil fuels by 2050. Finland has made a commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. Iceland is saying 50 to 75% by 2050. Norway wants to be carbon neutral in 2050. That's going to be interesting given their economic base. And then Sweden wants to have their net emissions, thing is saying carbon neutral, their net emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, having no net emissions of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So these are all pretty ambitious goals. And so here's the strategies for getting there. First of all, expanding renewable energy base. For instance, Denmark, expanding Denmark, and to some extent Norway, expanding their wind power base. Greenland, which is actually a territory, I believe Greenland's a territory of Denmark, is looking at a significant expansion of hydropower. And then Finland in particular, and parts of really looking at biomass as a way of providing significant amounts of energy. Although this is controversial, there's Sweden and Finland looking at their continued use of nuclear. Big thing, particularly in the urban areas, is upgrading building energy efficiency. Big thing that Sweden is good at, Sweden has really been pushing, is this idea of cogeneration, which basically means taking the waste heat from, say, a biomass power plant, or for that matter, taking the waste heat from an industry and distributing it into pipes to residential areas. That's what we call district heating. Electrification of transportation or a shift to biofuel. Again, we have Norway committing itself to, by 2050, having a fully electric transportation system. Also, one thing we look at here is reforestation and forest management to increase what we call carbon sink. In other words, using trees, increasing tree cover to pull carbon out of the air. I'm going to skip one down for a moment, expanded mechanical sequestration. My bet is, I have not seen this in any of the literature that I've seen yet, is that countries such as Norway, who are looking at continuing to have a fossil fuel infrastructure for a while, are going to be seriously looking at what we call mechanical sequestration. Some of you might be familiar with carbon capture and storage. Taking carbon right out of the air in some cases, or out of the waste streams of a coal-fired power plant or oil-fired power plant, and injecting that into the ground. One thing that Norway has been doing has been carbon offsets. So rather than necessarily reducing the amount of carbon they're putting in the air, they're using the money from their oil industries in some cases, other industries, to fund reforestation projects in developing countries. And last but not least down there, carbon tax policy, tax and policy and economic incentives. Sweden has been particularly aggressive about what we call carbon tax and cap and trade. There we go. There's so many little things to keep in mind here. So basically, the whole strategy that Sweden has been doing has been trying to make it so it is more cost-effective to rely on renewables than it is to rely on traditional fossil fuels. And if you think that's a little funky, one of the things about that is that their economic incentives are based around the idea that there are hidden costs to putting all this extra carbon into, and those have to be factored in when you're talking about fossil fuels. Okay, so Act 4, last act. And for this, as far as the Nordic contribution, I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, COP26, what it is and what's at stake. Second, what the Nordic countries bring to the table. I do have an invite that I'm going to pass out to the folks here at the Nordic Center at the end. But first, let's try to get a little handle behind it. COP26 is the 2021 UN Climate Summit. Some of you might remember COP21 back, or the Paris Agreement. It generated the Paris Agreement. That was in 2015. This is several generations later. It's slated to be in Glasgow, Scotland, provided over by the United Kingdom in collaboration with Italy. Italy wanted to have COP26, but UK claimed it. Incidentally, it got delayed a year. Give you a sense of what it's like. Well, that one picture up there in the top, that's the convention center where it's slated to be held. But it's a meeting of delegates from about 197 countries and several thousand, say 10,000, of observers from all across the planet. And again, my wife and I had the good fortune to be some of those observers in 2017. Now, why this one is important? Well, big surprise. We're at a watershed dealing with a pandemic that has really done nasty things to our economy. We're having to restart our economy. We're also at a point where in 2018, the International Panel for Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, published a report called, sometimes shortened as SR 1.5, or Global Warming in a 1.5 world. And in that report, what they basically said, that if we want to stay on track to a 1.5, they were saying very important to doing such things as preserving coral reefs, making sure that countries like Micronesia are not underwater. Then we've got about a decade to accomplish the things that the Nordic Council has. I shouldn't say the Nordic Council, but the countries of the Nordic Council. So COP26 is a pretty critical forum for determining how to achieve. Now, what the Nordic countries bring to the table. First of all, they've got their commitments. And the nice thing about the red charts is they've actually followed through in some of those. Norway's got some work, but you've got commitments from all the Nordic countries to decarbonize their economies by the mid-21st century. You've also got some trends in their policies, economics, that indicate that realizing their goals are possible. But as I mentioned, with the economics of some of these countries, the trends in their policies, trends in both their policies and economics, provide a little bit of challenge to realizing those. One of my experiences, our experiences, I should say, in terms of the past COPs is groups such as the Nordic Council have had a major presence in what's called the civil society side of conferences. And last but not least down here, the Nordic countries, even if they're not part of the EU, have all shown support and have a significant involvement in what's called the European Green Deal, sort of the EU's equivalent of the Green New Deal. So with that in mind, I'm going to do a little postlude here and give Scott a chance to talk about some Nordic notables, and then I'll talk about some resources and some questions.
Okay. You want to put that slide on? Okay.
Yep, there it is.
There we go. Do I face this way? Okay. So on the slides up here, and so first of all, Frank, thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful talk on all these different topics. And he's very, very tied in, as you noted here. He also had his second vaccination yesterday. And so he's been in bed sleeping all day to make sure he had enough energy, and he had definitely enough energy tonight to do that. And so thank you for this. I wanted to mention two things, and and he's going to mention Will Ferrell. But the face of climate change, not only for the Nordic countries, but the whole world, is Greta Tunberg. She was Person of the Year 2019 on Time Magazine. And she, back in 2017, 2018, she would sit out in front of the Swedish parliament with a big sign saying, we need to do something for the climate. Nobody would do, people were passing her. Pretty soon, people started interviewing her, and she was only 15, 16, but very, very articulate. And then pretty soon, students all over Sweden were saying, yes, we need to get on this, and we must do something. Pretty soon, students around the world were doing the same thing, say we need to do something for the climate. And so she's the face of young people saying we need to think about the future for us because we are going to be living through this. And she is Swedish. And so I think that is something very, very special there. The other thing is, when you think of Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland, do you think of polar bears? No. But there are two other Nordic places, Spitsbergen and Svalbard, and then also Greenland, which are administered by Denmark and by Norway. And there are lots of polar bears there. And on one of these Friday night lectures in the past, I got a chance to talk about Svalbard, Spitsbergen. There are so many polar bears there that kids going to school have to carry guns because they may be roaming around and interfering with them. But why is the climate going to affect polar bears? Well, number one, they need that sea ice that Frank mentioned, and it's decreasing and decreasing every year. They live on the sea ice. What do they hunt? They hunt seals. And if they float around, and the pregnant females hibernate on the sea ice in the wintertime. And so if that is decreasing and their areas where they are fishing for the seals is decreasing, they are doomed. And so we have lots of them in Canada and Alaska and Russia, but also two Scandinavian countries, Spitsbergen and then also Greenland have them. And so we are concerned about those. So I just wanted to throw those two in. I'm going to turn it back over to Frank, and then he's going to mention Will Ferrell and kind of tie things up, and then it's time for questions. Thanks again. Oh, by the way, there is one good thing about climate change. Some of you know that I like wine. And as the climate is growing, there are now over 20 wineries in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, in each one of those countries. They were making no wine 10 years ago. So that is positive, but that's the only positive thing I can think about. Back to you, Frank.
Okay, thank you. So again here, anything that's in shade of green, if you get the actual, if you connect in with this media, which is actually online, the one that says Will Ferrell actually will take you over to the Super Bowl commercial, GM Super Bowl commercial that spent a long time dissing Norway because of Norway's commitment to eat. Talking about, we can't let this happen, we're Americans, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the other one down there, it says the Nordic response, is the one I love. And it's a neighbor's son who teaches in Bergen sent me over that one. And that is University of Norway's response to Will Ferrell. It is worth looking up. There's actually one that I forgot to put down, which is the geography lesson given by 4 Norwegian elementary school kids, standing on the wharf waiting for Will Ferrell to get to Norway when he discovered he was actually in Sweden. Anyway, yeah, so one of the things, I've got just one quick slide I want to show you. Oh, wait, what happened? Oh, there we go. Okay. One quick slide I want to show you. This slide right here is, again, sort of a reference slide that if you, again, get the media, you click into the, you can click in and get some of the actual documents that I use to do the research on this. One that I want to suggest in that list, because it's very readable, is the Climate Change Post, Center for Climate Adaptation. This comes out of Stockholm. And it is a very, very good sort of synopsis of individual impacts happening in individual countries. I really recommend taking a look at that. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, yeah, good. Went back there. I wanted to pop this slide back on because of Greta. And this is Greta talking at the 2019 UN Climate Summit, which is top 25. And what I'm actually going to pose as an invitation to folks is that I have been involved with folks from OMSI and Lewis and Clark, as well as Greater Portland Sustainability Education Network, back in 2019 to develop what we called a virtual bridge to COP25, which was in Madrid. And the reason for this was because in coming back and speaking about our experience at COPs 23 and 24, first of all, we discovered very few people knew anything about what was happening at very critical events here in the Portland area. And then the second thing that I discovered is you could practically attend every single meeting, with the exception of the closed negotiator meeting, happening at these summits, because the UN was essentially connecting people over via on demand. And in some cases, you could do this live, although that's a real trick when you're dealing with someplace in Central Europe. Noon is 2 in the morning. But in any case, there, the virtual bridge to COP25 that the folks I mentioned, we had 2 public gatherings, one at OMSI, other one at Lewis and Clark, hearing from people locally about efforts parallel to what was happening in Madrid, but also talking with people via Zoom who were on the ground in Madrid. And one of the reasons I bring this up to all of you right now is because, again, one of the major players, I will assume our major player again, is the Nordic Council. And so given the technology that you have here, I think there's a lot of potential there for being able to connect up people in your organization with people doing climate work in the Nordic area and do it real time. So anyway, so with that in mind, I'm going to pop that up.
Sonia Haugen, committee for Friday night lecture. I'm here tonight to share some questions from our audience. And the first one, it is said that the Gulf Stream may change its direction due to warming of the seas. You're nodding yet.
That's a possibility.
What is the status of that prediction? How does it affect the Nordic countries?
Well, what I have heard, again, this is not my field of expertise, but what I've heard is, the function of the Gulf Stream is essentially taking warmer water up along the eastern seaboard from the lower latitudes of the Atlantic, moving that up and along the bottom of Greenland and Iceland, and then back along the edge of Europe. So it's essentially moderating the climate. If that somehow changes, then we're gonna start seeing. And we could actually see. I hesitate to say this, but I could conceive there might be a well, that's another whole ball game right there, is that one of the other things that you have is just you have what's called a downwelling zone, which is essentially where cold, salty water sinks down to the bottom of the ocean. And it's part of a whole big process called the ocean conveyor belt. I think I got that right. Which is essentially a way of being able to move heat around from the atmosphere into the ocean and back up again. And there's been some issues about whether or not, as the Greenland ice cap melts, kicks out a bunch of fresh water, that you shut that off. Which I don't know how many saw the movie The Day After Tomorrow. Ever see that? It's a rather dramatic of this, but this whole idea that we get thrown back into an ice age because of fresh water being dumped into. Anyway, that's pretty speculative stuff, and that's not. It's great for those of us who are kind of climate geeks to play around with, but a lot of unknown. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Why is it that the Arctic temperature is changing so much more rapidly than it is in the rest of the world?
Okay. Big question is, what's the dominant color? If I want to throw out a guess, what's the dominant color up in the Arctic? White. So remember I said that one of the things that happens as you get warming temperatures is a decrease in snowfall, decrease in ice pack. Well, that white color is essentially reflecting a great deal of the incoming solar radiation back out into space. Start changing the color of the ocean. Start changing the color of the landscape so it becomes darker. More energy is absorbed. And I'm sure there's other factors in there as well, but that's not sure what those would be.
Scott, did you have a comment? Okay. Okay. Oh, why did the global CO2 levels rise in 2020 if the CO2 emissions from human sources dropped?
Okay, fill up a bathtub sometime. And so you fill up a bathtub and you've just got, and you leave the stopper out. And so the water's draining out the bathtub at a certain rate. And if you have a rate that is faster coming out of the faucet than it's going out the bottom, the bathtub will rise. So yes, between 2019 and 2020, we decreased the amount of CO2, but not at a level sufficient that we were getting extra CO2 taken out of the atmosphere. Again, it's like a bathtub.
Personal observation, you talked about the high temperature events, unusual. I think it was, I go to Norway with some regularity, and I think it was 97. We were there for about 3, and every single day it was 85 above. And of course, there was no air conditioning. We had rented a car that did not have air conditioning, and we were melting.
Yeah.
So I had personal experience with one of those that you. Given that Iceland's dependence on fossil fuels is the lowest of any Nordic nation, why has its net greenhouse gas emissions increased 90? I think you earlier said you didn't really know the answer, but do you have any speculation as to why that may have happened?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Iceland is the fact that a big bulk of their energy production goes in. I mean, there's when we were in Iceland in '99, one of the things that was happening was bauxite being mined down in Africa was being shipped up to Iceland to be processed. And this was all being run by a Swiss company. And so my speculation would be that there's some part of that industry they're acquiring some fossil fuels. I know coal is used in the smelting of iron, I believe. I'm not, but they're mainly processing. So I wish I knew. It's one of the things I scratch my head about continuing.
Regarding the Nordic commitments to emissions reduction, What is the difference between carbon neutral, no net emissions, being independent of fossil fuels?
Who's making up the policy?
Oh,
Net emissions, let's see, carbon neutral and having zero net emissions, it basically means that you are not putting carbon into the air, greenhouse gases into the air, any faster than they're being taken out, either by natural or artificial. The Denmark being independent of fossil fuels, that's what I'd like to see, because of the fact that Denmark's, you look at the figures for Denmark's electric power production, they import at least 50% of their electric power. And so where that's coming from, not exactly certain. Maybe coming from Sweden. Or,
I've heard that it comes from Norway. At least that's
that,
what the
well, that
travel
would make
people
sense.
tell you.
That would make sense.
Because they produce a lot of hydropower,
Yeah.
electricity in Norway.
Yep.
Is there, you listed a lot of positives and negatives and things that would happen and how it might affect one country or another, and not all things affect all countries in this case. Is there one country that is more vulnerable at this point than one of the other countries? And one that's least vulnerable? You talked about the flooding in Finland.
Yeah, I'm thinking that it's kind of a wash. You're looking at unique vulnerabilities in each case. I would say that probably the closer you are to the Arctic Circle, or the more you've got above the Arctic Circle, the bigger the change. But that's just speculation.
Each country has to be concerned about vulnerability, looking for what it needs to do to protect itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the remarkable things that I've seen so far is that there seems to be quite a bit of cross-fertilization, trying to really cooperate on efforts.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for here tonight, and for those of you on the line, and to our speakers. Give them a good hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You almost knocked the Scot off the pedestal. And
I don't knock Scott off the
and I
pedestal.
just want to say you were so well organized and so clearly prescribed that even I understood almost everything. and I was especially happy to hear that Denmark has the highest reduction of emissions. That made me very happy. And I think you could, did you mention that Denmark has 20% wind power used for electricity? Did you mention that or not? Otherwise, I'll mention it now. I didn't have a chance to ask a question, so I would like to ask one. I would think that Finland, it's covered by 70% of forest, has some advantages over the other countries that has few. Denmark has only 15% forest. How does that influence that Finland might be better off? That was a hard one, huh?
Yeah, well, the only thing I can think of in response to that is Finland having, first of all, Finland's an important piece of the picture just in terms of forest management to do carbon sequestration. Mm-hmm. So that's important. The other thing that I imagine would probably be important in their energy picture is high reliance on biomass. In other words, burning wood to do things like produce electricity or wood waste.
Okay, well, thanks for that. But
Okay.
you can take that show any place to the parliament in Sweden. And I think that Greta Thunberg would be very proud knowing that we here in Oregon, in the Wild West, are interested in climate change in the Nordic countries. But thank you so much
Sounds
for
good.
coming, and thank you for Scott for coercing you to come here.
Yeah. And again, I want to say this is delightful to actually be in front of a group of people. Sure. You know, one possibility is that's not the cleanest way to produce power by any stretch of the imagination, because remember, you're burning municipal and, in some cases, industrial waste. And so you better have a very, very good pollution control system on that. So I know that there's a plant here in Oregon, I think, that's been proposed, that there's been a lot of argument whether or not to include that plant in some of the renewable energy related legislations that have been going through the state. So
Even in Denmark, we are criticizing those things because they think it's not clean enough.
yeah. Well, I mean, you look at what goes into a waste stream. This could be interesting.
I would think that the Scandinavian countries would be further along than, for example, Greece and Italy, where we can spend much money on climate change than the other ones. So we'll be further along, would we not?
I'm sorry.
I said we can spend so much money on climate change in Denmark because we are rich countries. Wouldn't it be better off? We would get further along than, for example, Greece and Italy and Spain.
Yeah, now you're hitting the interesting aspects of any of the UN climate summits.
Okay.
Because there's always that issue of, okay, everybody needs to be talking about carbon reductions, but there are some countries that can't afford it right now.
Yeah, that's true. But
And
Denmark,
so-
I mean, the Scandinavian country can afford to do something about it. We can in Denmark.
Yeah. Well, and there's a really important piece of the UN negotiations that has to do with developed countries financially helping, or developed countries financially helping developing countries to be able to also do the carbon mitigation and adaptation they need to do.
Would you say we're a little further along than the U.S.?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are. I think we are.
I mean, I'm very hopeful now in terms of I'm very hopeful with the change in administration
Oh, yeah, maybe that would happen.
that things are going to change. But yeah, it's the United States has been very big, has been a very big player in the climate negotiations, but has also been not always the most cooperative player.
Okay. Well, it was an incredible, well-crafted presentation, and I loved the whole thing. And this
Thank
is
you.
the first time we had anybody speaking about climate change, so I'm very happy we got you, and I'm glad that Scott got you engaged. So I have a few announcements here. So the 7th of May, we have the last one of Growing Up. It's Growing Up in Iceland, and it's a real Icelander from the University of Oregon who is going to speak. And so that's going to be the 7th. And then I have something on June 12th. We are going to have midsummer here at Nordia House. We can have 150 people outside. We can have 83 people in here. And we are going to use Ross's property too. And we are going to have entertainment, and there's going to be things for children. and wreath making for the hair, and lots of food and music and entertainment. And you cannot just show up and think 1,000 people out on the lawn here. That's not going to happen. You must reserve your tickets, and you can do that already on May 12th. You reserve the tickets. You cannot come in without a ticket. And we had to restrict it a little bit, and we have 2 sessions, one from 11 to 2, and then from 3 to 6. So we get more people in that way. But it's going to be mini midsummer. We used to have it at Oaks Park, but we can't do that this year, so we're going to have it here. Everything is going to be live, so do show up, and I will encourage you to get the tickets early, because we're going to be sold out. If you come 2 weeks before, I think they're gone. So now you know, you are forewarned. So this is really all I have to say. And you also look at our website to see we have different things during the summer months. We might have things outside, we might have things inside. So, and thank you very much for coming, for the people who are sitting home and on their sofas, and for the people who showed up here tonight. And thank you to you too for coming. It was great.